Well, welcome to Reclaiming Place, a civic conversation. Welcome to Pepperdine. But what a strange location for talking about place. Is Malibu an ironic choice for this conference? Some may think of Malibu as one of the contemporary symbols of the fake, the temporary, a space not deeply shaped by history or tradition, a space occupied mainly by people who are citizens of the world rather than provincials who are in love with what is peculiarly their own. To be sure, Malibu is a very different place from St. Francisville, Louisiana, the home of our keynote speaker. Dynasties are possible in Malibu, but not duck dynasties. Still, if you have some serious time to spend with locals, you will learn there's a very distinctive sense of place here. Dana Joya makes a strong case for LA being a real place in our book. And I can make a case also for Malibu expressing a strong sense of place. There's something that one can call Malibu-ness. And while the roots in Malibu do not go back centuries, it has a history that's both rich and essential to understanding the city as it now exists. I encourage you, in fact, to wander the halls of the Drescher campus, where you find photographs that give you a sense of the interplay of human choice, geography, and of time on the Malibu that you've seen it today. And yet, I do want a bit later to raise some serious questions about the nature of this community and ones like it. The way people here make their living, how they relate to work, how their work and their ideals shape the way they connect as locals. Indeed, Malibu is a very interesting place to ask broader questions about how economic and cultural stratification in California and elsewhere alters the kind of civic, cultural, and social relationships that emerge in cities and towns. How a place that has so many citizens of the world might have problems producing citizens of a local place. I was intrigued to learn from our dean, James Wilburn, of a speech given on this land before the campus was built, or rather, as it was being built, by one of our previous school presidents, William Banowski. As the college was moving from Los Angeles to Malibu, as it was taking this open space and turning it into a specific place, Banowski stressed that this new campus would be consecrated to a mission. Quote, "What we hope to create here in these hills," said the president, "is a spirit of place. A place where minds will be changed, where lasting relationships will be formed. A college is something like a human being in that both must have a soul of some kind. It is in this spirit that we hallow this ground and accept this challenge. These historic acres along the rim of Malibu will, from this day, never again be the same." End quote. And so here we have come to this place, to a campus that is carved out of the hills for the purpose of asking these kinds of questions. This afternoon's event continues a project that seems to produce its own energy. It began when Bill McClay and I organized a conference in March of 2011 called A Place in the World, Geography, Identity, Civic Engagement in the Modern World. You can't have a conference without a colon. The rather large conference was followed almost exactly a year later with a smaller conference called Why Place Matters, Moving from Theory to Practice. These two events suggest the challenge that we have undertaken, to focus serious attention on both theory and practice. Our first two conferences provided most of the essays for the book that Bill and I edited, Why Place Matters, Geography, Identity, and Civic Life. Today's conference is designed to keep that conversation vigorous and fresh by thinking through the themes of that book and asking a series of questions of how we can, particularly in California, take measures to reclaim our places so that these cities and towns can provide the conditions and context for a much more energetic civic life. Along the way, we have been helped by many people and institutions, including the Lyndon Harry Bradley Foundation, the Earhart Foundation, and for this event particularly, both the Davenport Institute and the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, as well as some key funds from our dean. Without their support and the tireless efforts of the school's staff, we would not today be having this conversation. All good conversations change focus. They build on previous discussions, and often they aim at getting greater clarity as well as a way of guiding action. Indeed, the subject of place can be very abstract. Sometimes those who are most eloquent about their love of place do not so much love their own places. They are more in love with the idea of place. That, by the way, is not something to mock, but something to understand. It goes to the very heart of the most basic human questions about what we need or for what we yearn. What is it about the human that wants roots? Why do we sometimes feel alienated from the very places that have structured our lives? How can we think about the practice of placemaking until we understand what places do for people and to people? Those questions, by the way, serve as the primary concerns of the book that today we're launching. And I want us to keep coming back to those, but I also want to ask, what do we add to that conversation? So one problem that we need to explore is what happens when we think of place in such abstract ways, and when we engage or relate to places that we actually inhabit in ways that do not encourage loyalty and love for something specific, tangible, and understandable, where the places of our lives never really become our place. Taking our book as an indication of the state of the conversation so far, I want to introduce a theme or two that I think we have neglected. Themes that might be particularly helpful this afternoon as we talk through not only the idea of place in general, that is in the abstract, but especially relating our ideas to the circumstances of California cities, which you'll find in the second panel. A generation ago, Gene Elstein, Christopher Lasch, and others reminded us that the discussion about the decline of community, so popular in the 1980s and 90s, were inadequate because they didn't deal directly enough with the physicality of place. After all, in the 80s and 90s, we began to talk more and more about communities as unattached to places. Communities of discourse. We could have internet communities, virtual communities. Moreover, they claimed, the communitarian conversation was insufficiently grounded in the basic requirements for healthy democracy. A democracy that deserves the name and is not just a description of democratic procedures. It requires a common life. This is Christopher Lasch's favorite phrase for it, a common life, a life in common. And requires that to be a citizen brings with it the obligations to gain the knowledge appropriate to civic life. Those are in fact tied together. But a society that has a healthy common life breeds respect for fellow citizens, fosters loyalty for those, for what they together inherit, create, and pass down. And it produces a felt belief that together they stand for something more noble than self-interest or the naked virtue of tolerance. Such a society generates in its members the kind of character and knowledge necessary for the civic conversation. Of course, to talk this way is to suggest that the democratic virtues that many of us so admire require a certain connection to physical places rather than metaphorical communities. At the heart of the common life that serves as the condition for healthy democracies is self-rule. The habit, desire, and obligation to govern ourselves together. You need to keep that whole part of that phrase together, that we govern ourselves together. Self-ruling is empowered in more ways than one. It confers respect and fellow feeling for other citizens. It encourages people to think of themselves as responsible for their own lives in ways that also war against an isolationist individualism. For Christopher Lasch, a place can sustain a common life only if it supplies real work. Work here means labor, something I'm not familiar with, personally. Work here means labor and production that is oriented around the needs of a city, the particular city or town, and often work that is made possible because of where the town is located. The argument about work and place is intriguing and raises questions we don't often examine. How important is it to the community to have a large percentage of its citizens work in jobs that are necessary for the physical needs of that city? Beyond that, how important is it that professionals, so we go from laborers to professionals, the lawyers and the doctors, in a town to find most of their work connected to the community in which they live? And what of the wealthy? Does it matter that the wealthy of a community put down deep roots in town, focus their philanthropy on the needs of the place, from cultural goods like orchestras to educational goods like libraries or humanitarian goods like hospitals? Lash offered no classless model for healthy places, nor one oriented around tolerance or simple acceptance. Rather, by stressing that healthy places grow from work, from the recognition of the dignity of labor, and the way work can create ties among people in a specific place, Lash is asking us to consider the complex layers of associations, the forms of reciprocity, as well as the sort of respect and loyalty that emerges in very particular places where labor serves as the foundation of the social order. Lash's argument is much more complex than I have here rendered it. But as I've sketched it, he raises serious questions about how we live relative to our physical reality, how we think of labor, and how our civic, cultural, and social loyalties change as the nature of work changes. But in fact, it isn't really just the nature of work generally. It is the work, and hence the world, of our elite, our financial, academic, and entertainment elite. In 1995, he wrote this, quote, "The thinking classes are fatally removed from the physical side of life. Hence their feeble attempt to compensate by embracing a strenuous regime of gratuitous exercise." He had a thing about exercise, by the way. "Their relation to productive labor is that of the consumer. They have no experience of making anything substantial or enduring. They live in a world of abstractions and images, a simulated world that consists of computerized models of reality, as distinguished from the palpable, immediate, physical reality inhabited by ordinary men and women. Their belief in the social construction of reality, the central dogma of postmodernist thought, reflects the experience of living in an artificial environment from which everything that resists human control has been rigorously excluded. Control has become their obsession. In their drive to insulate themselves from risk and contingency, against the unpredictable hazards that afflict human life, the thinking classes have seceded, not just from the common world around them, but from reality itself." End quote. Perhaps one question that Lash's critique might produce for us concerns how the nature of today's inequality, which he suggests is different from earlier forms of inequality, the nature of our elite, which is different, and of their work, which is different, how all those things affect our common life and how it alters our loyalties. When it comes to our concern for healthy places, should we think not only about the problems associated with economic inequality in the abstract, but also the nature of the elites in this system and how they relate to place? Consider how this new elite of the last 20 or 30 years, 40 years, understands their loyalties. To what moral causes do they give their money? And how has that changed the nature of the privileged classes? What happens to the perception of physical reality, particularly of place, when their work has little or no connection to specific locations, where wealth is generated in an abstract global economy, and where they don't relate to laborers as fellow citizens? What are the consequences for place, for politics, for loyalty, for the common life? That is the basic of a healthy democracy. I do not know the answer to these questions, but I do know that members of the privileged classes, of which there are so many in California, have deep moral concerns, and they devote time, energy, and resources to those causes. We might wonder if those moral causes are supportive of healthy communities. We might think about the moral commitments of those whose wealth is great, who have no tangible connection to labor as a means of production, and for whom increased cost in support of those moral causes is no hardship. So if their desire for sustainable living, whatever the global sustainable living leads to a doubling of their gas bill or of their food bill, it has no identifiable effect on their life. But it does for the other people whose lives they are not in. What if their primary moral concerns are global rather than local? Is it possible the nature of their work, more than their wealth, makes them see moral concerns in a certain way? Is it possible the struggle over the water supply here in California between the farmers of the Central Valley and certain elite whose environmental concerns seem to them self-evidently true, good, and noble even, takes a peculiar shape because of the privilege of the morally righteous class, whose relationship with productive classes is most abstract. At least for Lash, it seems that the more disconnected the elite become from the laboring classes, and the more they operate in a world of abstractions, the less they understand the experience of those whose livelihoods are tied so directly to the physical world. Whether you're persuaded by Lash's concern about the nature of the new elite, I raise the question for today the relationship between the nature of today's inequality, in particular the nature of the elite and their relationship to work, and the needs of building a common life that makes civic conversation possible. Have the elite abandoned our places in ways that make healthy local communities much harder, in ways that create a more polarized politics based on the great distance between the experiences of the many and the experiences of the few? These questions are open, not rhetorical. But I remind you that this is a conversation with us to begin with and a conversation with you to end with. And like all good conversations, it will go in directions we cannot entirely predict. I want to now introduce to you the participants in this part of the conversation. You have, I hope, the program that gives fairly full bios of them, so I'm going to sketch them briefly. Our keynote speaker, who will speak next, is Rod Dreyer. You may know him, or at least I got to know him primarily through his Crunchy Cons book, which I actually used in a couple of classes here. His new book, The Little Way of Ruthie Lemming, is a memoir of going home, or trying to go home in some ways. A memoir of his sister's death and the experiences of trying to go home and what he learned from that. Some of which you'll hear today, I think. He is an interesting combination of the provincial and the cosmopolitan, having lived in many places, having engaged in the kind of abstract labor, abstract work that I've talked about, who now lives in a very rooted place for which he has historic connections. Following Rod, we have Susan Mcwilliams, who is a most independent thinker, hard to categorize. She's an associate professor at Pomona College, whose work in political theory and political thought is always bracing because never predictable. Most importantly, she writes for Front Porch, as I do. So for those of you who know, she's a porcher. Bill McClay, who will follow Susan, is my partner in crime. We've done many projects together, and he has now found his way to the University of Oklahoma, which I think is moving up in the world in several ways, not just academically, but culturally. He is the G.T. and Liddy Blankenship Chair in the History of Liberty. He has a number of works. I would direct you especially to the work that stunned me and forced me to call him years ago, The Masterless, Self and Society in Modern America, which is still, I think, one of the best works of intellectual history of the last generation or two. So, without further ado, I ask Rod to come to the podium.